Yes, we're live. Welcome everybody to the Google Hangout session about the first case study about financial crisis, the second Google Hangout. I would like to welcome Dirk Bezemer and Lex Hoogduin. We all know that both professors from the MOOC, Decision Making in a Complex and Uncertain World. And maybe they can introduce themselves a little bit more. Dirk?
Yes, so my name is Dirk Bezemer. I'm an associate professor at University of Groningen, teaching a course in global finance and growth and other courses, and doing research on how the financial system relates to the economy's growth and stability. That's enough for now.
So I'm Lex Hoogduin. I'm part-time professor at the University of Groningen in complexity and uncertainty of financial markets and financial institutions. Apart from that, I'm on a number of boards of companies, and perhaps the most interesting one to mention here is the board of LCH Clearnet, a worldwide central counterparty clearing financial products. And I'm also one of the teachers of this course.
Thank you. My name is Tim Menkveld. I'm a teaching assistant from this course. No doubt that you've seen me in the forums. And right now I will do this interview. I have collected all the interesting questions from the forums, and I will ask them to Dirk Bezemer and Lex Hoogduin. And I suggest that we get started with that. Oh, by the way, I want to dedicate 10 to 15 minutes to questions from the audience, and you can ask them in the Q&A section that's working tonight. So we'll see how that goes. The first question. If people in the United States were spending money, and this meant that the economy was growing, why were wages not increasing if companies were selling more goods and therefore increasing their profits? If wages had increased in line with the economy, perhaps people would have stopped borrowing against the value of their property, and the whole problem would have been slowly returned to the previous trend without causing a huge crisis. Is that a too simplistic view? Dirk?
No, I don't think that's a very simplistic view. Actually, it's the view of many renowned academics who say that inequality is one of the big causes of the latest big crisis, and the fact that wages did not keep up led many people to borrow more, and therefore is one of the drivers of the crisis. So I don't think that's a simplistic view, and it points really to the importance of broader macroeconomic policies in preventing financial instability. So there's a lot of talk about banker bonuses and capital buffers and very specific financial sector things. But this is a much broader issue. We need to stop the rise in inequality because that can be one of the drivers of behavior very widespread by all or by many households, which causes financial instability. So I think that's just an excellent point. The thing is, we know very little about this. There's the famous book by Piketty, of course, or Piketty, as Americans would say, which argues that inequality is dangerous for the economy. But it's such a new topic, and we've only started thinking about it in earnest over the last few years, that we need a lot more research on that.
Yes, very, very little to add to that, perhaps a little elaboration. That indeed, the question then is, why did wages not go up? And indeed, we do not know a lot about that still. There are some hypotheses, very general, and it shows how complex, let's say, trying to understand economic developments is. For instance, one possibility is that there is pressure on wages in developed countries, wages in the middle class in particular, because of the process of globalization, which shifted labor demand to the emerging economies and led to a lack of demand for certain skills in the developed economies, and that led then to downward pressure on wages, and that then led to the developments that led to the financial crisis. So that's one hypothesis. As usual in economics, it's seldomly the case that there's just one explanation. Other explanation may be that because of certain technical developments, the demand for middle class labor, people with middle class income, has dropped relative to the demand for people with very high incomes, and that led to a squeeze on the middle class, and then also to the financial crisis. So there is a lot of further work to do there, and I think the point that Dirk made, I would like to underline finally. It's really a complex phenomenon where you seldomly have just one cause, but you have to look at the broader overall picture.
All right, thank you. I see that a lot of new viewers have joined us, and I just want to say to them that you can use the Q&A function from Google Hangout to ask your questions, and we'll dedicate some time for your questions. So let's move on to the next question then. This one comes from David Archer. Dirk Bezemer has talked a lot about the fragility that was present in the United States financial system in 2007-2008. Which reminds David Archer of the quote from Nicholas Taleb that said, not seeing a tsunami or an economic crisis coming is excusable, but building something that is fragile to them is not. Are these examples comparable?
Yes, they are comparable in a sense. And I think, and this was the remainder of David Archer's question, is that it points to a whole new way of doing economics. It would be a bit too simple to say that we can understand the economic system in the way that we understand how to build bridges in a very deterministic way. We can calculate precisely what weight the bridge can take before it breaks. Up to a point, that's a useful comparison, but it's much more useful when we talk about complex systems. Uncertainty is much more useful to think about sister sciences like meteorology, the science of weather, or to think about earthquake science. I live in an area where we have small earthquakes now and then, but still very distressing earthquakes, and it turns out to be very difficult to predict when they will happen, how heavy they will be, and so on. But it doesn't mean we can't do science. We can do science about uncertain events. We can predict the weather with some degree of accuracy and only a couple of days ahead. But we can do science and we can learn more about it. And the trick there is to have a complex system way of thinking. What is that? Well, it means that you can still start with the behavior of individuals, but you need to recognize that individuals interact and that the sum is more than the whole of the parts. Mm-hmm. So you need to take into account how individual units, firms, banks, households, governments, how they interact, and how this gives rise to so-called emergent properties, to properties of the whole systems, characteristics of the system, which you can never understand by only looking at the individuals. And then you can start building a picture of the behavior of such a complex system. So I think we shouldn't be discouraged, but on the contrary, we should be encouraged to use more complex system type of science and apply it to understanding economic crisis. Because only in extreme cases, like in the years 2003, 4, 5, 6, in such extreme cases when a financial crisis is very close, some people who take the right perspective can say with certainty, this is going wrong, this is going the wrong way. But many people in many circumstances can say, hold on guys, we have increasing financial fragility, we have increasing vulnerability to shocks. And I think that's the most useful kind of knowledge. Instead of trying to predict crisis, try to monitor the system we are in and to say whether we are increasing our fragility, our vulnerability, or whether we are decreasing it. So that's the challenge for today's economics, I think.
I find this a fascinating and a great question, and I agree that, let's say, engineering of bridges and other constructions and fragility in economics is comparable. I think Dirk used the word up to a certain point, and then elaborated on, let's say, what you can do there. I think it's a fascinating question. We don't have enough time to discuss it. Why it is up to a point. So where the comparison does not hold, and I can just give some reflection, food for thought, as it were, instead of having a complete answer. There's no time for that, and I also don't pretend to have it. But the point in economics is that a fragility depends on human judgment in the end. Economic values, the prices of stocks and so on, are in the end are subjective valuations by people. And an economic crisis can be seen as a sudden breakdown of valuations. So you are discussing the vulnerability as a human being of your own judgment, which is probably qualitatively different from trying to judge something that is outside, let's say, human beings themselves, and which you can quantify and which where you have rather solid knowledge. The point about financial crisis is that the knowledge itself, the assessment of the future, as reflected in prices, breaks down, and that may be qualitatively different from let's say engineering. Nevertheless, I think all that Dirk said, what you still can do in such circumstances, emergent behavior, discovery of patterns, still holds, but it makes it very difficult to be very precise on the moment that you will have such a breakdown, and how much, let's say, resilience you need to overcome a certain breakdown. So there may be a difference.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to the next question then. This question comes from David Evans, and he writes, aren't swings in the complex financial system inevitable when we have the regular switching of ruling parties from left to right every 5 years or so?
Yeah, that's a natural question, of course, given the large influence of politics, of rulemaking, financial authorities on the financial system. However, when you look at those things that really determine financial trends, they are more long-term things. They don't change with every government. For instance, the preference for home ownership, which has really been building since the 1960s in many Western countries, the UK, the US, many Western European countries. That's something that left-wing, right-wing parties, many different parties have shared through the years and through the decades indeed. And we now know that this preference for home ownership has encouraged reckless mortgaging, to put it very bluntly, and has been one of the causes, the political long-term causes of the financial crisis. Take another example, financial deregulation. Certainly since the late 1980s, there has been very large deregulation of previously installed regulation. And again, this has happened in many Western countries. It has been practiced by right-wing governments, by social democrats, by parties of all political colors. So I think something else is going on here. It's not to do with every 5-year change of government. It's to do with things like social mood, like shifting norms, which we all share. And that's the important thing. That's really long-term important thing when we look at the interaction between politics and the financial sector. It's a long-term, and often, when you look on a year-to-year basis, the slow change in regulation, but above all in rules and in norms, in what we find normal, which determines what sort of financial system we will have. And that makes it so difficult to think of quick fixes, to say, well, if the government would only do this, or, oh, that stupid government has 3 years ago, changed this or that rule. Often it's a much more different thing. I mean, the amount of mortgage debt that my generation had would have been almost criminal to my grandparents' generation, right? And that's an example of the shift in norms, which goes on over a longer term, which will find expression in political choices, but not by any political color typically, because it pervades the whole society. It even pervades financial regulators. So you can't simply blame the regulators, because we all are in this same social mood, and we all are subject to these shifting norms. And that's a real challenge, explaining the shifts in norms and finding ways to safeguard the financial system, to keep it flexible, not rigid, but at the same time not losing sight of the need for safety when we don't know what safety is, because it's not a nominal thing. It's changing over time. It's all about our own assessments.
Yeah, I think it is important in this question also to make a distinction between, let's say, different types of swings or fluctuations that you can have, or cycles that you can have in the economy. it is true that there is a lot of literature and also empirical evidence of, let's say, the political cycle, the election cycle, having impact on the economy in a way, to put it relatively simply, that by the end of a term of a government, that government tries to please the electorate and starts to spend more, and then hopes to be re-elected, and then can do, let's say, the more nasty work at the beginning of its next term, and that introduces some fluctuations in the economy. The economy then starts out with a boom, starts out with a, let's say, a moderate development, and towards the end of the period there is a boom produced by the incumbent government. So that's in the real economy, and these are short-lived cycles. So that's in employment and in real growth. What we are talking about in the financial system are longer-term swings, most of the time. And let me add one additional, let's say, theory or pattern that can explain such cycles. That is that at a certain point in time, something new happens in the economy. That may be that new norms may develop, or new products may be developed. There may be innovations. There may be regulation or deregulation, a change to the economy. That then leads to opportunities for investors to profit from that. But it's very difficult to calculate what the right price, for instance, for a stock is. And then, so people start to buy. Some people see new opportunities, start to buy. Stock prices go up, and then that gets its own dynamic, because you cannot calculate the right price. So prices go up, and then people start to buy because prices go up. So just because prices go up, and then it gets its own dynamic, and then at a certain point, this is no longer sustainable, and the whole thing turns around. So this is a very quick outline of a theory which, as a basis, has that we cannot know the future, so we cannot calculate what the exact value of a new product is, a new environment is. So that's always a subjective assessment based on norms, partly, and it has to do with very deep, let's say, characteristics in human behavior, that people want to follow a certain trend, that they want to be part of a herd. If your neighbor is starting to profit from the stock market, you don't want to lose out, so you also join. That type of mechanisms. So the combination of not knowing the future and human characteristics can explain the patterns, very abstract, general patterns of financial cycles. So that's not directly related, let's say, to the far shorter political cycle, although elements in the political cycle, as Dirk also explained, can have an impact in this precise evolvement of the financial cycle.
All right. Good. Let's go to the next question. A recurring theme in the case study was the so what concern. Fragility is a very helpful concept, but how should we actually use it? Dirk, can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of research now, of course, in the last few years about financial fragility. And I wouldn't ask the so what question because, to my mind, if anything is, let's say, the new economic theme of our time, it's financial fragility. Why is it so important? Well, if we know how to operationalize financial fragility, that is, how to develop measures that we can observe as red flags for the danger of a financial crisis, then we have an underpinning to build policy on. Still, we must have political preferences to actually stop bubbles if they happen. But the first is how to know how to identify the danger of a bubble or the danger even of a financial crisis. That's what financial fragility is about. So how do we do that? Well, there is research over the last few years which points to a few very practical factors. So nothing so practical as a good theory. And the theory of financial fragility, if you put it in its most general term, is that if the financial system starts to move towards speculation instead of income, then you're in for danger. And that's just the kind of development that Lex just described. When people start investing for capital gains, which means they start investing because they expect price increases in whatever they invest in, rather than they investing in something to produce goods and services and to generate income. So the difference between income and capital gain, revenues from production and revenues from buying and selling and nothing else, is a crucial one. And that's a difference that the classical economists made, but which has been lost in mainstream economics. So that's something that we need to hold on to. When we translate that to financial markets, to credit, a big difference is between mortgage credit and all kinds of loans to buy existing financial assets or existing real estate, property assets, housing and land and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, productive credits, or credit for non-financial firms for the production of goods and services. For instance, research, empirical research with numbers, figures, very hard-nosed, if you like, shows that those economies which have more mortgage credit, mostly household mortgages, more mortgage credit before the crisis, are also those economies which suffer more severe crises, more serious recessions, longer recessions, more output loss, and so on. Economies with more mortgage crisis, in any case, have a bigger probability to have a crisis at all. There's work at the Bank of International Settlements to show that if both asset prices increase and leverage increases, so debt to income ratios, if asset prices and debt both increases together, that's a red flag. That's a very good indicator for financial fragility. And you can do this analysis on the level of economies, but also on sectoral levels. So I think we really don't need to ask the so what question. There are some very practical applications of the financial fragility concept emerging, and they center to the distribution of debt. Debt in itself is not bad. Debt is a great human invention, we know that. But what are we using debt for? What are we using leverage for? If we use it to generate the income from which we can repay debt, that is sustainable. I mean, financially sustainable. And then we have low levels of financial fragility. But if we are using debt and generating debt, taking on debt, in order to speculate, to buy and sell for capital gain, that's a zero-sum game. It doesn't give society more income to pay the debt from. So we're passing around the hot potato, leverage is going up, debt levels are going up, and then you're really increasing the chances of a crisis. So what the debt is used for, income versus speculation, to use that old-fashioned word, I think that's the key application of financial fragility theory.
Just to elaborate a little bit on this theme, I think we should not underestimate how important the introduction of the concept of fragility is. And perhaps to a non-economist, everything that Dirk said sounded very logical and natural, and I think it is logical and natural. But if you go back to how many economists looked at the economy and looked at financial crisis before the crisis in 2007-2008, then it will strike you that looking at the financial system as a system was not very frequent. So the whole issue of what is the state of the financial system as a whole was not often asked, and if it was asked, it was seen as simply following from the soundness of individual banks in the system. And so what is really an important change is that the crisis triggered the idea that indeed you have to look at the financial system as a system, and that it is not right and not very informative to only focus on individual institutions. to the extent that in the past there was a focus on the system as a whole, very often the focus was on trying to read from market prices whether the system was in good state, as it were. And what we now have learned, and what the concept of fragility tackles, as it were, is that it is you're making a big mistake by trying to assess from market prices whether the system is at risk. Because what we see, and we also saw that in the run-up to the 2007-2008 crisis, that people start to become very optimistic in the course of the run-up, in the boom phase of the crisis, and that is reflected in prices that show that people assess the risks in the system as very low. And it's the essence of a crisis that happens, so that you at a moment that people are very optimistic, at the same time the system is vulnerable to sudden corrections in value. So you should not focus on market assessments of the health of the system, but you should have something else, and that something else is the fragility of the system. And Dirk has explained how, let's say, how at the moment we try to measure that, and I think there's a lot of further development to do that. But I think it's a big step to look at the system as a whole, and to realize that you cannot assess the healthiness of the system by looking at what the people being part of the system think of it, because that's exactly, let's say, that's the wrong way, because people over-assess the healthiness of the system at a moment that it is most vulnerable. So it's almost the opposite.
Okay, very good. Let's move to the next question, which is actually really related to what you just said, I think. This one comes from Andrew Carr. He said, traditionally the focus was on stock market rather than real estate bubbles. Authorities in the United States use levers, such as margin requirements to restrain irrational exuberance. Nothing like that has been done in decades. And before you answer, I didn't know the word exuberance, but I looked it up, and I think it might be helpful for other students as well that are watching. And it means the quality of being full of energy, excitement, and cheerfulness. So, Dirk, can you answer this question?
Yeah, so traditionally the focus was on stock markets, is the start of that question, and rather than real estate bubbles. I think, and the question also mentions the lack of margin requirements, which means limitations to the extent to which you can lever up your lending, so to which you can borrow, let's say, a number of times, X times the money that you have. That's leverage, and that's what margins are all about. I think there's two types of answers. So why haven't we anticipated that the trouble was in real estate? The first answer is that regulators are always responding to the latest crisis, and the latest big crisis was maybe the 1929 New York stock market crash, which was all about margin problems. And which was a stock market crash, of course, and not a real estate crash in the first place. So into the 90s, really, or a lot of regulation was to prevent what had happened in the 1920s. And that may sound very naive, but that's the way the world turns, isn't it? Probably, everybody's now obsessed, really, with real estate markets, but who knows where the next bubble is developing. So that really holds a lesson for us, I think. The second reason why many people were and still are not so worried about real estate as an asset market is that there is this idea that, because houses are good, I live in a house myself, so how can houses not be good? Therefore, how can you think of this real estate market as a speculative, dangerous market? I mean, millions and millions of households are living in houses, need a mortgage to buy them, etc., etc. So, and this is a complex thing because housing, real estate, has this double quality of a, let's say, a long-term consumption good and a speculative good, right? It's not like an outright speculative good, like a financial asset, where maybe non-economists can easily see, well, this is not something you can eat or drink. This is not something that produces anything. So yeah, we can more easily see this as speculative. For housing, that is much more difficult to see for most people. And yet, I think most financial crises are real estate related crises. And real estate markets are the biggest asset markets in every country, even in the US with its massive stock market. And speculation in real estate assets is almost the easiest thing to do and to happen, because so many people are in that market, and because mortgages are such widely traded products. So to recap, I think it's both because of history, because the latest big crisis was a stock market crisis, and because it's still difficult to understand how precisely real estate markets can be at the heart of a financial crisis.
Let me elaborate on another aspect of the question, or perhaps extending the question a little bit, and also building on the answer to the previous question. How come that for so many years economists, regulators indeed did not have real attention for the system as a whole, and only focused on individual institutions? I think it's a deep question that cannot be answered in full, but let me give some thoughts about that. If we go back in time, what we see is that let's say around the 1980s, a strong belief in the beneficial working of markets appeared. The time of Thatcher and Reagan, the idea that markets to a large extent were self-correcting because of people acting with their own interest, and that would result in self-correcting markets. That was the broad view. That view seemed to be vindicated by actual developments. We entered into a period in which inflation came down, in which the real economy became more and more stable. Economists came to call that period the period of the great moderation. They did a lot of research on how come that we had this increased stability. And that was, again, it was attributed to the idea that we had deregulation, that we had liberalized markets, and that markets, to a large extent, indeed, were self-correcting. And it was also the idea that, as an element of that, monetary policy had really contributed to that. So a certain confidence in the power of own policies developed. And as I said, all that was vindicated by a rather stable environment, whereas underlying all these, the fragility, as we would now call it, was increasing leverage and so on and so forth. But there was no attention for that because of the actual developments, which were rather stable and in line with the belief that indeed markets were self-correcting. And then all of a sudden, in 2007, 2008, we had this turnaround. So it's a nice example, if I may refer a little bit to what we learned in this course, of a tipping point where you have a non-linear process, where you have a period of calm and stability for, in this case, I think almost 30 years. And then all of a sudden, you have a tipping point where the whole thing breaks down. And this type of process is not a type of process that you can easily understand or even analyze within the neoclassical mainstream view of looking at markets, which very much underpinned the beliefs since the 1980s, and that has now turned around, and therefore there's also the question of how to. Now we have seen that can happen. How can you describe it? And that's what explains the interest in alternative theories, like complexity theory, like uncertainty theory, and which also drives attempts at adding to the mainstream view or changing the mainstream view to be able to accommodate that.
Okay. Thank you. Looking at time, I think we have time for one more question. So perhaps, yeah, this one. Is the sign of complexity and uncertainty, especially in the economic context, still in development, or has it already a rather out-crystallized form, structure, and definitions? Is it a component of a larger science, physics, systems theory, or a standalone track in science? And if the science track split in branches, or is there a central regarding or survey maintained if complexity and uncertainty theory is still in development? So that's a set of I think very relevant questions, rather general. So not just focused on let's say the topics of this the topic of this case study of last week. I think no, in economics this is not crystallized. There are a lot of open issues. I think there are very many fruitful questions that you can ask and try to elaborate on using the complexity theorem, as it were, but also there are a lot of open conceptual questions. What is exactly the complexity way of looking at the economy, and how does that interact with the theme of uncertainty? That's also central to our course. And I think the fascinating thing is, so there's a whole range of questions going from very fundamental, the type of questions that you also listed. Is there via complexity and uncertainty, can you build a bridge between, let's say, to start with the life sciences, the social sciences and biology, or are there even wider bridges? Can we unify, in the end, all science under one umbrella via this theorem? These are very fundamental questions, open questions, but I think that the complexity paradigm opens up a way of thinking about that. So these are the very conceptual questions, but there are also very, very practical and political questions related to the questions of the day. Let me put it in the context of, let's say, the case study topic of the financial crisis. Thinking about the lessons of the crisis, we already discussed, let's say, the introduction of the idea of that you have to look at the system as a whole, that you have to introduce a concept like fragility. Another interesting concept that was underused, as it were, in the past is the idea of diversity, which is common in biology, biodiversity, but in economics we focus more on diversification of portfolios rather than diversity of a system. So another example of a very fruitful idea to develop. Very practical questions on how to supervise a complex system. All kinds of proposals are on the table of changing the structure of the system. The question then is, what will the impact be of such changes? And I think complexity theory and a complexity way of looking at things, for instance via networks, as we have discussed during this course, can be very fruitful, and there's so many very practical questions. So for me, the fascinating thing is that I think there are many fruitful questions to answer, to elaborate on, and how there many people feel attracted to that field. But there are already some
some answers. But again, it's by no way a kind of a settled field already.
Okay, Dirk, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would absolutely underline Lex's point that there is great diversity and that we've only started to take complexity economics seriously. There is a small, and even then, as I've been learning about this in the last few years, there are different streams. There is something called econ of physics, which, as the name says, is more like physics. And then there's other things like agent-based modeling, which may be more related to how social scientists think about systems. There are scientists who try to describe nonlinear systems in a few very simple equations. I was doing a seminar last week with the research group around Carl Schmollers at the University of Amsterdam, where they're doing this. And then there's other economists who say, no, you need to truly build a system, build a theoretical model from the ground up, populating it, so to speak, with agents such as banks and households and firms, and then simply letting it evolve, computerize it, simulate it, and study the patterns that will emerge without one master equation which governs the behavior. In both cases, you can get sudden transitions, so truly complex behavior. But the question is, how do we best understand why the system behaves as it does? So even apart from the political questions and the practical question about how do you govern a complex system, how do you understand the complex system? It is a complex question in itself. And this is a great time to be an economist because the profession is now relatively open to such new methods and ideas in a way in which they haven't been, at least not in my lifetime.
Okay, farewell. I want to thank you both for answering these questions, and I think it's time to call today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Pleasure.